Pauline Epistles. Let's take a look at what are the Pauline Epistles. Let's look at some general observations that will help us to understand and interpret the Pauline Epistles. And finally, ask a very important question: is there a center of Pauline thought? The Pauline Epistles, or sometimes we say the Pauline Corpus, consists of 13 letters in the New Testament. A number of them are undisputed, meaning to say that very few, virtually no scholars would question whether they were written by the Apostle Paul. There are two that are debated, maybe we can say 50-50 on scholars, whether they are written by the Apostle Paul or by someone else. And then there are three that are widely rejected. Although they bear the name of Paul, they are widely rejected by scholars as having been written by him. The undisputed ones are Romans, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Galatians, Philippians, 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, and Philemon. Perhaps 2nd Thessalonians might fall into one of the other categories, however. The ones that are widely debated are Ephesians and Colossians. We could say perhaps that those two books fall on either side of the 50-50 mark. The majority of scholars would still accept Pauline authorship of Colossians, a slight majority, and a slight majority would reject Ephesians as Pauline. I myself did an extended study on the relationship between Ephesians and Colossians. My conclusion was that they had the same author. I didn't press it in that study whether that was Paul or not, although I tend to think it was Paul. The ones that are really doubted by the majority of scholars are what we call the pastoral epistles. One of the characteristics of those is that they are written not to a church, but to a colleague of Paul, or I should say colleagues of Paul, 1st and 2nd Timothy on the one hand, and then Titus. They differ in that respect from Philemon, in that Philemon, although addressed to an individual, is also addressed to the house that the church that meets at Philemon's house. Some general observations when we come to the Pauline epistles. We need to recognize that they are really letters. They are real letters that were written by, in most cases, Paul, and dispatched to particular readers. There are consequences for how we understand them when we recognize that they're real letters. They're what we call ad hoc, meaning for a particular purpose. One of our jobs as interpreters is to say, what is that purpose? Why were these letters written? And for some of them, it's very, very clear. Others, it's really difficult. For example, Romans. Why was Romans written? What's the purpose? And that has caused a lot of problem in the history of interpretation of Romans, because some earlier scholars had thought, well, there's no real purpose. It's not for a particular situation, but rather it was just timeless compendium of theology. Well, we've come to recognize that that's a misunderstanding of Romans. Romans, just like the others, was a letter written for a particular audience. Our job is to trace out what is that, who was that audience, and what was the reason that Paul was writing to them. Another general observation is that the letters of Paul can fit quite nicely into the framework that is provided by the historical framework provided by the book of Acts. So there's a strong correlation historically between the book of Acts and the Pauline epistles. So it gives us a lot of confidence going into the reading of the Pauline epistles that they are historically accurate, and vice versa, that Acts has a lot of historicity as well. Of course, we can say that the epistles of Paul are collected into a corpus. Corpus meaning the body of work that Paul produced. The question, an interesting question, is who collected them? We don't know, but one interesting suggestion is that it was collected by the author of Acts. One of the interesting observations there is that if you look at Acts, you can recognize that all of the epistles of Paul are to cities that Paul is mentioned to have gone in the book of Acts, except for Colossians. One scholar very intriguingly suggested then that the author, or rather to say the collector of the Pauline Corpus was from Colossians. And by the way, Philemon is not mentioned as well, that Paul went to Philemon, except to say that Philemon was living in Colossae. So with those two books, both of them from Colossians. So this scholar suggested that maybe Acts got published and disseminated, not published quite the way we have it today, but sent out, and then somebody in Colossae got a hold of it and said, well, I have a letter of Paul, and now I remember that Paul went to all of these other places. I wonder if they have a letter from Paul as well. And so to go and to all of those cities and say, excuse me, church members, do you have a letter from Paul? Why, sure we do. Here it is. And so collected that way. It's an intriguing idea, but it helps us to think about the historical circumstances about how these letters got gathered, even if we can't come to a final understanding of that. One last thing to mention is that a few scholars, I shouldn't say a few, but some scholars have suggested that some of the letters that we have are actually compiled from several letters, maybe fragments of several letters. This is especially argued for 2 Corinthians. So we can talk about the integrity of the letters. Do they consist of a single letter that all came from the hand of Paul, or several letters from the hand of Paul but compiled together, or in some cases maybe letters of Paul but compiled with some non-Pauline material? So those are questions that scholars ask very frequently. Let's turn to this vexed question about the center of Paul's thought. Did Paul have one driving idea that held everything together for his way of thinking? That's what this question is all about. At the Reformation period, the answer was yes, there is a center of Paul's thought. And we know what that center is. It's justification by faith. The Reformer said that's what Paul is all about, justification by faith. And everything is related to that. So they read all of the Pauline epistles looking for that key idea. But recently, relatively recently, there's been what's called the new perspective on Paul. And they're saying maybe there is a center. But if it is, it's not that one. It's not justification by faith. First of all, they recognize that Second Temple Judaism is not characterized by works righteousness, but rather by what has been termed covenantal nomism, meaning following the law because you're in covenant already. So the Reformers said Paul's problem with Judaism was that Judaism was based on works righteousness, and so he rejected that because he said we should be based on justification by faith, not by works. Of course, Paul does say justification by faith, but that's not, the justification by works is not fair to accuse Jews of that. So why would Paul have left Judaism? It can't be for the reason that the Reformers thought, even though that is an important element, but it's not the core. It's not the center. It's not the driving force of what Paul had, what Paul was doing. So if Paul's problem with Judaism is not faith versus works, why did he leave Judaism? One of the things that we can say is to remember the occasional nature of Paul's theology. Occasional meaning it's constructed for an occasion. Remember that Paul was convinced that Jesus was coming any second or any day now. He's coming. And so Paul was not sitting in his study, in his office, constructing so carefully exact wording and making sure everything was consistent all throughout. No, he was writing to address particular needs at a particular moment. So we can say occasional, or ad hoc was the word I used before. So one suggestion of the new perspective on the center of Paul's thought is Jew and Gentile unity in Christ. So Paul is concerned that all of us are sinners in the same way. And we're all justified in the same way. We're justified in Christ. So we find several key words in that way of thinking. This phrase, in Christ, is so important for Paul. And unity. Unity is throughout the Pauline epistles. And not just unity generally, but Jew and Gentile unified in Christ. So when we come, for example, to the famous verse in Romans chapter 3, for all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. What's the all there? In some ways, it might be better to understand that as both. For both have sinned. Both meaning, on the one hand, all of the Jews have sinned, and on the other hand, all of the Gentiles. So all are equally sinful. And therefore, we come to faith, we come to salvation in the same way. So when we read the Pauline epistles, some things that we should keep in mind as we try to understand them. First of all, we need to determine the historical context as closely as possible. What is Paul trying to achieve in writing to this audience at that time? What was he doing there? We also need to interpret very humbly, because we recognize that we can say it this way, we're reading someone else's mail. This is not our mail. It wasn't written to us. It was written to somebody else. Some consequences of that. When we try to read someone else's mail, we might miss some of the details that they know. They know because they're in relationship with one another. They know all that's going on. So we have to be very careful when we try to reconstruct that historical situation, recognizing that some things we just can't know. And so when we come to the Pauline epistles, we need to be very humble about our interpretation. And finally, when we apply these, we need to apply according to the intended meaning for the first century audience. It's easy to get sucked into thinking that this is, because Paul was such a good writer, it feels like it was written to us. It feels like it's a word directly to us. But it's first a word to the first century. And we have to understand what it meant to the first century. And that's what we need to apply. So we have to do a lot of work to read those texts in their historical context so that we can then understand how it becomes a message for us today.